The morning hours of March 3, 1943, found the destroyer Yukikaze cutting through the waters of Huon Gulf off New Guinea's coast, and from her deck, Japanese naval officers strained their eyes toward an approaching formation of aircraft. What they observed defied every tactical manual they'd ever studied. A dozen twin-engined bombers were streaking toward them so close to the ocean surface that their spinning propellers actually churned up visible spray trails on the water below. Officers lifted their binoculars for a closer look and counted something that seemed tactically insane. American bombers attacking at what looked like mast level, flying lower than anyone had thought militarily sensible or even survivable. The next quarter hour would completely reshape how everyone thought about naval power in the Southwest Pacific Theater. Before those 15 minutes elapsed, 8 massive transport vessels loaded with nearly 7,000 Japanese reinforcement troops would be transformed into blazing wreckage scattered across the sea. 4 destroyer escorts that had successfully shepherded countless convoys across the Pacific since the attack on Pearl Harbor would be broken and sinking. Every assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy held about how aircraft and ships fought each other would be going down into the depths of the Bismarck Sea, alongside close to 3,000 Japanese military personnel. What those Japanese officers didn't yet understand was that these approaching aircraft weren't standard-issue bombers flying standard missions. These were B-25 Mitchell medium bombers that had been fundamentally transformed by an unconventional engineer, a man named Paul Gunn, who everyone called Pappy. His modifications had turned ordinary bombers into something closer to flying warships, each one bristling with 8 machine guns firing 50-caliber rounds straight ahead. The engagement they were about to witness would prove beyond doubt that American creative engineering had produced something the Japanese military establishment had never conceived as possible. These weren't bombers that would circle overhead dropping munitions from altitude. These were aircraft that would skip their bombs across the water's surface like flat stones, while simultaneously pouring streams of armor-penetrating bullets into their targets. The convoy that had departed from Rabaul shortly after midnight on the first day of March represented Japan's last serious attempt to send major reinforcements by sea to Leh. General Hitoshi Imamura commanded the 8th Area Army, and his forces desperately required these reinforcements to maintain their hold on New Guinea, which served as the final protective barrier for the southern approaches to the Japanese Empire itself. The escort force fell under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who had assembled 8 of the Imperial Navy's most combat-experienced destroyers for the mission. Shirayuki, Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo formed a protective screen around the convoy's core. Inside that screen sailed 8 transport ships carrying the 51st Division's troops, specifically 6,900 elite soldiers, plus enough supplies and ammunition to keep the Leh garrison functioning for months ahead. The transports themselves were Ayomaru, Kenbo Maru, Kyokusei Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, Teiyo Maru, and the naval auxiliary vessel Nojima. Japanese planners had worked out every detail of the convoy's departure with meticulous care. Weather forecasters predicted 3 full days of storm conditions, which would provide perfect concealment from American aerial reconnaissance. 100 Zero fighters stationed at bases in New Britain and New Guinea would maintain continuous air protection over the convoy. The planned route hugged close to New Britain's northern coastline, keeping the ship's exposure to open water as brief as possible. Captain Tamichi Hara commanded Yukikaze, and after the war he would write Japanese destroyer captain, detailing his experiences. He'd noticed troubling changes in how the Americans were conducting air operations recently. Their bombers were coming in at progressively lower altitudes, and their aircraft were showing up with unusual modifications. According to what he documented later, superior officers generally dismissed such observations, attributing them to American desperation leading to tactical errors rather than deliberate innovation. What the Japanese command structure didn't know was that a revolution in aerial combat techniques had been underway in the workshops around Port Moresby and Townsville for months. Beginning in August of 1942, Major Paul Gunn, who'd previously flown for the Navy before transferring to Army Air Forces, had been systematically transforming medium bomber aircraft into something nobody had seen before. Gunn's innovations emerged directly from operational necessity. Conventional high-altitude bombing tactics against naval vessels achieved success rates below 1%. When bombardiers released weapons from 10,000 feet altitude, even the most skilled among them struggled to hit targets that were moving. Ships could observe bombs falling through the air and had minutes available to maneuver away. Anti-aircraft defensive fire proved highly effective against aircraft flying at medium altitudes. The situation demanded something radically different. Working with salvaged components recovered from wrecked fighter aircraft, Gunn installed 450 caliber machine guns into B-25 noses, replacing the bombardier's transparent compartment with solid metal construction. He added 4 additional guns mounted in packages below the cockpit area, creating a total of 8 forward-firing weapons. Each individual gun could fire 850 rounds per minute, with each bullet traveling at 2,910 feet per second. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously under the pilot's control, a single B-25 could deliver 6,800 bullets per minute in a concentrated forward stream. Major Ed Larner commanded the 91st Bomb Squadron within the 3rd Bomb Group, and his unit had spent weeks perfecting what they called skip bombing. Flying at 200 feet or lower, they would release 500-pound bombs equipped with specially configured delay fuses. These bombs would skip across the water's surface before slamming into ship hulls. The delay fuses were set for 4 to 5 seconds, providing just enough time for the attacking bomber to clear the blast zone before detonation. Crews practiced the technique repeatedly on the wreck of the SS Pruth in Port Moresby Harbour until they could reliably hit their practice targets. Through extensive trial runs, they established optimal parameters. Altitude needed to be between 200 and 250 feet. Speed had to be maintained between 200 and 250 miles per hour. Bomb release needed to occur 60 to 100 feet from the target vessel. The protective storm cover the convoy was relying upon began breaking up sooner than meteorologists had predicted. At 10 in the morning on March 2nd, a B-24 Liberator on routine reconnaissance patrol spotted the convoy through a gap in the cloud cover. Within hours, 28 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers from the 43rd Bombardment Group were airborne from Port Moresby heading toward the target. The B-17S attacked from 7,000 feet altitude, lower than their standard bombing height, but still above the effective range of most anti-aircraft weapons. They bracketed the convoy formation with 1,000-pound demolition bombs. At 2:45 that afternoon, the transport Kyokusei Maru took direct hits in her forward cargo holds. Fires spread to ammunition storage areas, forcing the crew to abandon ship. 900 soldiers were evacuated from the burning transport onto the destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo. These 2 destroyers, now dangerously overloaded with evacuated troops, raced ahead at maximum speed toward Leh to offload their human cargo before rejoining the convoy early on March 3rd. This emergency run succeeded in saving those particular men, but reduced the convoy's destroyer escort strength during a critical period. What Japanese commanders didn't realize was that the B-17 attack had served as reconnaissance by fire, testing defensive capabilities and forcing the convoy to break its protective formation in preparation for what was coming next. Allied operational planners had deliberately employed high-altitude bombing first to assess anti-aircraft capabilities and compel the convoy to scatter. The morning of March 3rd dawned with clear skies over Huon Gulf, disastrously clear conditions from the Japanese perspective. The convoy had rounded the Huon Peninsula during the night hours and now found itself exposed in open water only 80 miles from its destination at Leh. Safety seemed tantalizingly close. At 7:55 in the morning, lookouts aboard Japanese vessels spotted the first attack wave approaching from the southern direction. But these aircraft weren't flying at 7,000 feet like the previous day's B-17s had done. They were skimming just above the wave tops, so low that spray kicked up by their propellers was visible to observers. As the attacking aircraft closed to 2,000 yards distance, their noses erupted with streams of tracer fire. 8 lines of bullets from each modified B-25 converged on the ship's anti-aircraft gun positions. Japanese gunners attempting to man their defensive weapons were cut down by the concentrated fire before they could effectively engage. Those who sought cover couldn't defend their ships while hiding. Following behind the strafing B-25s came Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, adding their own devastating firepower to the assault. 4 20mm cannons and 6.303 machine guns per aircraft. The combined assault from American and Australian aircraft proved overwhelming, effectively suppressing anti-aircraft defences across the entire convoy. At precisely 10 in the morning, Major Ed Lana led 12 B-25s from the 91st Bomb Squadron into their attack run. Flying in flights of 3 aircraft at 200 feet altitude, they bore down on the convoy at 250 miles per hour. This was the moment months of intensive training had prepared them for. The lead bomber released its bomb approximately 300 yards from the transport Shinai Maru. The bomb struck the water, skipped twice across the surface, and impacted the ship's hull just above the waterline. 4 to 5 seconds after release, exactly as the delay fuse was timed, it detonated inside the cargo hold, literally ripping the ship apart from within. The transport Kenbo Maru was loaded with drums of aviation fuel, and when a skip bomb hit amidships, the explosion ignited her volatile cargo. The resulting fireball rose 500 feet into the air. The ship disintegrated in seconds, leaving only burning debris floating on the water. Ayomaru absorbed multiple direct hits in rapid succession. Her hull opened up like someone had taken a can opener to it. Oigawa Maru, attempting desperately to maneuver away from the attacking aircraft, took bombs from 2 different B-25s. Her back was broken by the explosions. She jackknifed in the middle and went down within minutes. The destroyer Asashio, under Captain Yasuo Sato's command, raced to position herself between the attackers and the transport ships. She was immediately bracketed by 3 B-25s. Skip bombs slammed into her engine rooms, while thousands of machine gun bullets swept every living thing off her decks. Dead in the water and burning fiercely, she became a stationary target for following attack waves. By 10:15 in the morning, exactly 15 minutes after Major Lana's first bomb had been released, 7 of the 8 transports were either sinking or already sunk. 3 destroyers, Asashio, Arashio, and Tokitsukaze, were mortally wounded. Shirayuki would sink later in the day. The convoy had ceased to exist as any kind of organized force. The destruction of the ships themselves was only the beginning of the tragedy that unfolded. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many of whom couldn't swim at all, were thrown into the oil-covered waters of Huon Gulf. Those who could swim faced a terrible choice. They could attempt to reach the New Guinea coast through waters infested with sharks and dangerous currents, or they could cling to floating debris hoping for rescue that might never come. The destroyer Shikinami, one of the few escort vessels still operational, began pulling survivors from the water. Captain Masamichi Ueno's crew worked frantically, hauling men aboard as quickly as they physically could. They saved approximately 300 in the first hour of rescue operations. But then American aircraft returned. The follow-up attacks on March 4th specifically targeted lifeboats and rafts. Machine gun fire churned the sea into foam. Life rafts disintegrated under concentrated gunfire. PT boats also participated in preventing Japanese survivors from reaching shore, following orders designed to ensure enemy soldiers didn't reinforce the garrison at Leh. For Japanese military observers who lived through the attack, it revealed a devastating truth about American capabilities. American innovation had created weapon systems they hadn't imagined were possible. The skip bombing technique, developed and perfected in just a matter of months, had no corresponding counter-tactic anywhere in Japanese military doctrine. Ships couldn't depress their anti-aircraft guns low enough to effectively engage planes flying at mast height. Torpedoes couldn't be aimed at aircraft. Traditional anti-aircraft defensive doctrine was completely useless against this approach. The firepower of the B-25s was particularly shocking to Japanese observers. Japanese fighters typically carried two 7.7mm machine guns, occasionally supplemented by 20mm cannons. These bombers carried 850 caliber machine guns, equivalent to the firepower of multiple fighters, all aimed forward, all controlled by a single trigger pull. Even more disturbing was the level of coordination displayed during the attack. The operation involved American B-17, B-25s, A-20 from the 3rd Attack Group, and Australian Bow fighters. Over 100 aircraft from different units, different services, even different nations, all working in perfect synchronization. They maintained radio communication throughout the battle, adjusting tactics in real time based on reports coming over the radio. As night fell on March 3rd, the surviving Japanese destroyers returned to the battle site, searching desperately for any survivors they could locate. They found a sea covered with debris and corpses. Oil fires still burned on the water's surface in multiple locations. The destroyer Hatsuyuki arrived from Kavieng bringing fuel, which allowed the rescue operations to continue through the night hours. In total, 2,700 men were pulled from the water and returned to Rabaul. Another 1,200, including those who had been landed at Leh before the main attack occurred, eventually made it to shore. Of the 6,900 troops who had departed Rabaul with high hopes of reinforcing New Guinea operations, 2,890 were dead. The 51st Division had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force before firing a single shot at the enemy. All the ammunition, food, medicine and equipment that was supposed to sustain operations for months had gone down with the transports. The aviation fuel that had been aboard Kenbu Maru, which was supposed to keep Japanese aircraft flying, was now just a slick on the Bismarck Sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who commanded the combined fleet, received the battle report in his cabin aboard the battleship Musashi anchored at Truk. According to staff officers who were present, he sat in silence for a prolonged period before speaking. The implications were immediately clear. Japan could no longer reinforce its forward garrisons by surface convoy anywhere within range of Allied aircraft. The lifeline to forward operating bases had been cut. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented more than just a tactical defeat. It marked a fundamental shift in how warfare would be conducted in the Pacific. Never again would the Japanese military attempt to reinforce their garrisons by surface convoy within range of Allied air power. The strategic implications rippled through every level of Japanese planning. General Imamura flew personally to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo to deliver his report. In a meeting that lasted 6 hours, he presented evidence demonstrating that American air power had evolved beyond Japanese ability to effectively counter it. The Americans weren't simply building more planes. They were revolutionizing how aircraft fought battles. On March 25, 1943, a joint Army-Navy Central Agreement on Southwest Area Operations gave operations in New Guinea priority over those in the Solomon Islands, but without the ability to reinforce by sea, it was essentially an empty gesture. Japanese forces in New Guinea would fight without any hope of significant reinforcement or resupply. For the Americans, the victory validated 2 years of innovation and adaptation. General George Kenney, who commanded the 5th Air Force, had transformed his force from a traditional bombing unit into something unprecedented. An aerial navy capable of controlling seas without requiring ships. Major Ed Larner, whose 91st Squadron had led the skip bombing attack, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the battle. The citation praised his extraordinary achievement in leading the attack that destroyed the convoy. Tragically, Larner died just 58 days later, on April 30, 1943, when his B-25 crashed on landing at Dobodura airfield. He had survived 87 combat missions, only to die in an accident. The North American Aviation Company immediately began incorporating Gunn's field modifications into factory production. By late 1943, B-25G models were rolling off assembly lines with built-in forward firepower, including even a 75mm cannon, though the cannon proved less practical in actual combat than multiple machine guns. The B-25H model would eventually carry 14 forward-firing machine guns. The B-25J could be configured with 18 guns, making it one of the most heavily armed aircraft of the entire war. Beyond the strategic implications, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented profound human tragedy on a personal level. The 2,890 Japanese who died weren't just statistics in a battle report. They were sons, fathers, husbands. Many were conscripts who had been farmers, clerks, or students before being drafted into a war they barely understood. The American pilots who followed orders to strafe survivors understood the military necessity of preventing enemy soldiers from reaching shore, but that didn't make the action any easier to bear psychologically. Some aircrew reported having nightmares about the strafing missions for years afterward. The success at Bismarck Sea triggered an acceleration of American tactical innovation across the theatre. Within months, new techniques were being developed and implemented. Parafrags, which were parachute fragmentation bombs for attacking airfields, allowed low-level bombing without the attacking aircraft suffering damage from their own explosions. White phosphorus bombs for marking targets became standard. Improved skip bombing fuses with more reliable delay mechanisms were manufactured. Each innovation built upon America's industrial capacity. Americans could afford to experiment because failure cost only material resources, and material was essentially unlimited from American production. Japanese innovation increasingly stagnated because every experimental attempt consumed irreplaceable resources they couldn't spare. By contrast, Japanese forces increasingly relied on spiritual rather than material solutions to their problems. The kamikaze concept, using pilots as guided missiles, emerged partly from recognizing they couldn't match American technology. If they couldn't outbuild or out-innovate the Americans, they would attempt to outdie them. Crucial to the victory was American code-breaking capability. The Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne and Naval Intelligence in Washington had decrypted Japanese messages revealing the convoy's schedule, route, and composition. General Kenny knew exactly when and where to strike, allowing him to position his forces for maximum effect. This intelligence advantage had to be carefully protected. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to discover the convoy, maintaining the fiction that visual observation rather than signals intelligence had provided the warning. The deception proved so successful that Japanese forces never realized their codes were compromised, continuing to use the same encryption systems throughout the remainder of the war. The Royal Australian Air Force's role in the battle demonstrated the superiority of Allied coordination. RAF Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron and Bostons from No. 22 Squadron flew alongside American aircraft, communicating on the same radio frequencies, following the same tactical plans. Squadron leader Bill Newton flew 3 sorties during the battle. He would later receive the Victoria Cross posthumously for his actions in subsequent operations before being captured and executed by the Japanese. The integration of Australian and American forces stood in stark contrast to Japanese operations, where Army and Navy units rarely coordinated effectively, often actually competing for resources rather than cooperating against the common enemy. Behind the modified B-25s that destroyed the convoy lay an incredible supply chain stretching all the way back to American factories. Each individual B-25 required 165,000 separate parts manufactured in dozens of different states. The .50 caliber ammunition they fired was produced in plants scattered from Connecticut to California, with billions of rounds manufactured during the war years. The skip bombing technique required special delayed action fuses manufactured by the millions in American munitions plants. The fuel for training flights came from Texas oil fields and Louisiana refineries. Replacement parts for damaged aircraft arrived weekly by ship from the United States. This entire supply chain operated while America was simultaneously fighting in Europe, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union, and maintaining forces across the Pacific. The Japanese convoy destroyed at Bismarck Sea represented Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea. The forces that destroyed it were a tiny fraction of American production capability. The American pilots who devastated the convoy had averaged 400 flight hours before entering combat. They had practiced skip bombing for weeks, using virtually unlimited fuel and ammunition for training. Each pilot had dropped dozens of practice bombs before the actual mission. By contrast, Japanese pilots entering combat in 1943 increasingly had less than 100 hours of flight time. Fuel shortages meant minimal training opportunities. The veteran pilots who might have taught them proper techniques were dead, killed by the industrial mathematics of American production. New Japanese pilots were essentially flying students thrown into combat against experienced American aviators. After Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces in New Guinea were strategically isolated. Supplies had to be delivered by submarine, which was dangerous and severely limited in capacity, or by fast destroyer runs at night, which were equally hazardous and insufficient for major operations. These so-called Tokyo Express runs could deliver only a fraction of what the destroyed convoy had carried. The Japanese turned to using barges, trying to creep along the coast at night with supplies. These became prime targets for PT boats and modified B-25s equipped with radar for night hunting operations. By June 1943, Japanese forces in New Guinea were on half rations. By September, they were reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and roots. The army that had conquered Singapore was literally starving to death, defeated not just by bullets but by interdiction, the cutting of supply lines through air power. For Japanese military culture, which was rooted in centuries of samurai tradition emphasizing personal combat and individual heroism, the industrialized slaughter at Bismarck Sea was incomprehensible. Traditional warrior values provided no answer to massed firepower delivered by machines. Japanese forces would increasingly resort to suicidal tactics throughout the remainder of the war. Banzai charges and kamikaze attacks represented attempts to find meaningful death in the face of mechanized killing. Americans would respond with more technology, more firepower, more industrial solutions. The gap between traditional warrior culture and industrial warfare would only continue widening. Pappy Gunn had installed cameras in the tails of his modified B-25s, activated automatically when bombs were released. These cameras captured the destruction of the convoy in devastating detail, ships exploding, capsizing, burning. The photographs provided unprecedented documentation of the battle's effectiveness. These images served multiple purposes. They provided accurate battle damage assessment, allowing intelligence officers to verify claims of ships destroyed rather than relying on pilot reports that might be exaggerated. They became training aids, showing future pilots exactly how skip bombing worked in actual combat conditions. They served as propaganda tools, demonstrating American power to allies and enemies alike. The Japanese had no equivalent photographic capability, relying on pilot reporting that was often inaccurate in the heat of combat. The B-25s that destroyed the convoy had been flying continuously for months in the harsh conditions of New Guinea. Tropical heat, humidity that bred corrosion everywhere, and coral dust that abraded engines. Yet mechanical failures during the mission were rare. American engines were over-engineered, with power reserves built in that allowed them to function even when not perfectly maintained. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, suffered from increasingly poor maintenance as the war progressed. Spare parts became scarce, qualified mechanics even scarcer. Engines that were theoretically superior to American designs in specifications failed more frequently because they couldn't be properly maintained in field conditions. The Navy's prized Zero fighters were increasingly grounded for lack of spare parts, while American aircraft flew daily missions. During the battle, American and Australian pilots maintained constant radio communication, calling out targets, coordinating attacks, warning of threats. Japanese forces, by comparison, had poor radio discipline. Ships and aircraft often fought in isolation, unable to coordinate effectively or warn each other of approaching threats. American pilots flew into battle knowing that if they were shot down and wounded, they had excellent chances of survival. Blood plasma, morphine, sulfur drugs, and eventually penicillin were standard in American medical kits. Medical evacuation by air was routine procedure, with wounded pilots often in hospitals within hours of being shot down. Japanese soldiers and sailors knew that serious wounds likely meant death. Medical supplies were desperately short even before the convoy's destruction. The medicines that might have saved lives were now at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. This knowledge affected morale profoundly. American pilots flew with confidence born of knowing they'd be cared for if wounded, while Japanese forces fought with the desperation of men who knew wounds meant death. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea cost Japan ships and aircraft it simply couldn't afford to lose. The 8 transports represented months of production from Japanese shipyards already strained beyond their capacity. The destroyed supplies and ammunition represented significant portions of Japanese production that couldn't be replaced quickly. For America, the battle was economically insignificant. The ammunition expended was replaced within days from existing stockpiles. The few aircraft lost were replaced within hours from reserves. American factories were producing 100,000 aircraft per year at this point. The fuel burned in training and combat was a rounding error in American petroleum production. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea reverberated through the remainder of the Pacific War in profound ways. It proved conclusively that air power could control sea lanes without requiring naval vessels. It demonstrated that industrial innovation could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could develop effective counters. For Japanese forces, it marked the beginning of the end in the Southwest Pacific. Cut off from reinforcement and supply, they would fight a series of desperate holding actions, each ending in annihilation or starvation. The island-hopping strategy became viable precisely because Japanese garrisons could be isolated and bypassed, left to wither away without supplies. The success at Bismarck Sea accelerated B-25 development dramatically. The B-25G, entering service in late 1943, carried a 75mm cannon, the largest weapon ever mounted on a twin-engine bomber. Though the cannon proved less practical than multiple machine guns in actual combat, it demonstrated American willingness to experiment boldly. Each successive iteration reflected lessons learned and industrial capability to implement changes rapidly. Post-war analysis of captured Japanese documents revealed how thoroughly the Bismarck Sea defeat had shaken Japanese confidence at the highest levels. Intelligence reports from the combined fleet emphasized American material superiority rather than tactical superiority, representing a significant shift from earlier assessments that had attributed American successes to luck or Japanese mistakes. One captured report stated bluntly that the enemy's production capacity allowed them to implement new tactics faster than counters could be developed. This recognition of industrial disadvantage marked a fundamental shift in Japanese strategic thinking. After Bismarck Sea, Imperial General Headquarters conducted a comprehensive review of Japanese strategy in the Southwest Pacific Theater. The conclusions reached were sobering. Surface reinforcement of forward bases was no longer operationally possible. American air power had achieved operational supremacy. The industrial gap was widening rather than narrowing. Traditional naval superiority was irrelevant if ships couldn't survive air attack. The recommendation was to abandon offensive operations entirely and prepare for defense of the inner perimeter. But even this defensive strategy assumed American attacks would come at a pace Japan could match, an assumption that would prove tragically optimistic. The skip bombing technique pioneered at Bismarck Sea spread rapidly throughout American forces. Navy PBY Catalinas adopted it for night attacks on Japanese shipping. Marine Corps pilots used it in the Solomons campaign. Even transport pilots were trained in the technique in case they encountered enemy shipping unexpectedly. This rapid proliferation was possible because America had standardized training, equipment, and communications across services. A technique developed in New Guinea could be implemented in the Aleutians within weeks. Japanese forces, divided by intense service rivalries and poor communication between branches, rarely shared innovations, even within the same theatre of operations. The numbers tell the story of American industrial supremacy that made the Bismarck Sea victory possible. During World War II, American factories produced 98,016 B-25 Mitchell bombers. Ammunition plants manufactured 12 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Flight schools graduated 193,440 pilots. Every conceivable B-25 component was stockpiled in multiple locations across the Pacific. Against this industrial tsunami, Japanese military courage was simply irrelevant. The bravest samurai warrior couldn't overcome the mathematics of mass production. Pappy Gunn's camera installations provided unprecedented documentation of combat effectiveness. The footage, studied frame by analysts, revealed optimal tactics that could be quantified. Bomb release at 200 to 250 feet provided best results. Approach speed of 200 to 250 miles per hour was optimal. Release distance of 60 to 100 feet gave highest hit probability. This scientific approach to warfare, measured, analyzed, and optimized, was quintessentially American. War became an engineering problem with industrial solutions rather than a test of warrior spirit. The loss of supplies at Bismarck Sea created an immediate crisis for Japanese forces in New Guinea. Within weeks, frontline units reported critical shortages across the board. Ammunition was restricted to 10 rounds per day per soldier. Rice rations were reduced to 400 grams daily per man. Medical supplies were completely exhausted. Fuel for vehicles was unavailable. Aircraft were grounded for lack of replacement parts. American forces, by contrast, complained if ice cream wasn't available daily. The economic disparity was so vast that captured Japanese soldiers often didn't believe American supply levels were real, assuming they were being shown propaganda rather than actual standard conditions. Success at Bismarck Sea accelerated American innovation in aerial warfare across multiple dimensions. Within months of the battle, new developments included improved skip-bombing fuses with more reliable delay mechanisms, napalm for area attacks on Japanese defensive positions, rocket-assisted bombs for increased penetration power, and white phosphorus markers for improved target identification. Each innovation was built on industrial capacity to experiment and implement changes rapidly. Americans could afford failed experiments because they cost only material resources. Japanese innovation stagnated because every experimental attempt consumed irreplaceable resources they desperately needed elsewhere. Behind every B-25 that attacked at Bismarck Sea stood a maintenance crew that kept it flying under primitive conditions. These men, working in jungle workshops in New Guinea, performed daily mechanical miracles. Engines were overhauled using improvised tools. Battle damage was repaired with whatever materials were available. Modifications were implemented with hand tools in field conditions. Aircraft were turned around between missions in a matter of hours rather than days. This maintenance capability reflected American industrial training at a fundamental level. Hundreds of thousands of Americans possessed skills in fixing engines, repairing electrical systems, and working metal. This vast pool of technical expertise was perhaps America's greatest military advantage, one that no amount of warrior spirit could match. The strafing of survivors in the water, controversial even among American forces, served a harsh military purpose beyond simple cruelty. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific learned through bitter experience that attempting to reach shore after their ships were sunk meant likely death from air attack. This psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate battle, affecting Japanese morale in future engagements. General Douglas MacArthur called Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement in the Southwest Pacific Theater. His communiqué claimed somewhat inflated Japanese losses in his typical style, but the strategic impact fully justified his enthusiasm. Air power had proven it could interdict sea lanes as effectively as submarines or surface vessels ever had. Admiral Yamamoto, reading the battle reports in his cabin, made a fateful decision in response to the defeat. He would personally visit forward bases to boost morale that had been shattered by the convoy's destruction. This decision, driven by depression following Bismarck Sea, would lead directly to his death on April 18, 1943, when American codebreakers learned of his travel itinerary and P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville Island. American forces institutionalized the lessons of Bismarck Sea with remarkable speed. Within weeks of the battle, training manuals were updated with skip bombing techniques described in detail. New pilots arriving in theatre were practicing low-level attacks as standard procedure. Tactical doctrine was revised across the board to emphasize anti-shipping operations. The Army Air Force's Tactical Center analyzed every aspect of the battle, producing detailed reports that were distributed throughout the Pacific. Japanese institutional learning was severely hampered by systemic problems within their military structure. Service rivalries between Army and Navy prevented honest analysis of what had gone wrong. The two branches blamed each other rather than examining fundamental weaknesses. Face-saving cultural concerns obscured actual failures that needed to be addressed. By the time Japanese forces developed partial counters to skip bombing tactics, Americans had already moved on to new approaches. The B-25 modifications that proved so devastatingly successful went into mass production immediately after the battle. North American Aviation's factories in Kansas City and Inglewood retooled their production lines within weeks. By late 1943, new B-25s came straight from the factory with 8 to 14 forward-firing machine guns as standard equipment, reinforced nose structure specifically designed for gun installation, upgraded engines optimized for low-level performance characteristics, improved armor protection for crew members, and built-in camera installations for battle damage documentation. This rapid transition from field modification to factory mass production exemplified American industrial flexibility that Japan simply could never match given their resource constraints. After Bismarck Sea, American bomber crew training incorporated low-level attack techniques as standard curriculum rather than specialized training. Pilots practiced skip bombing at training bases in Texas and Arizona, using target ships placed in the Gulf of Mexico and California's Salton Sea. This training was extremely fuel-intensive by any measure. Each individual pilot consumed thousands of gallons of aviation fuel just learning the technique properly. But America could easily afford it. By 1943, American refineries were producing 1.5 billion gallons of aviation fuel annually, while Japan struggled desperately to import enough fuel just to keep its remaining fleet operational. Several B-25s returned from Bismarck Sea with significant battle damage from anti-aircraft fire. Holes punched through fuselages, damaged control surfaces, shot up engines. Within 72 hours, every single damaged aircraft was flying combat missions again. They'd been repaired using aluminum patches fabricated right there in field workshops, engines replaced using improvised hoists and local ingenuity, control cables spliced with salvaged materials scavenged from wherever they could find them, and fuel tanks patched with rubber cut from destroyed Japanese equipment. Japanese aircraft suffering similar damage levels would have been permanently written off, cannibalized for spare parts if anything was salvageable at all. The delayed action fuses that made skip bombing operationally possible were marvels of precision engineering in their own right. They were manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. They had to survive the violent impact of hitting water at over 200 miles per hour. They needed to function reliably after multiple skips across the surface. They had to detonate at precisely the right moment, not too soon and not too late. American factories produced these complex fuses by the millions, with each one individually tested and certified before shipping. Japanese fuses, by comparison, had failure rates exceeding 20% by 1943, the result of quality control problems and severe material shortages affecting manufacturing. American aircraft found the Japanese convoy precisely when and where expected, despite weather conditions and distance. This reflected superiority in multiple areas of navigation training. American pilots averaged 400 hours of training before entering combat. Navigation equipment, including accurate compasses and instruments, was standard. Map quality was excellent, based on detailed charts from extensive pre-war surveys. Weather forecasting provided meteorological support that accurately predicted when the weather would clear. Japanese navigation increasingly relied on following lead aircraft or using coastal landmarks for reference, which severely limited operational flexibility. American intelligence had known about the convoy through code-breaking capabilities, but protecting this vital secret was paramount. Reconnaissance flights were carefully staged to discover the convoy, maintaining the complete fiction that visual observation, rather than signals intelligence, had provided the warning. The deception proved so thoroughly successful that Japanese forces never realized their encryption codes were compromised, continuing to use the identical systems that American cryptographers were reading on a daily basis throughout the war. The 1,200 Japanese soldiers who eventually reached Leh found a garrison already on significantly reduced rations. The supplies that were supposed to sustain operations for months ahead had been destroyed at sea. Within weeks, Japanese forces were desperately foraging for food in the jungle. Disease became epidemic across the garrison. Malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers, and severe malnutrition decimated entire units. By June 1943, the effective combat strength of Japanese forces in Leh had been reduced by 60% through disease and starvation alone, without the enemy firing a shot. American pilots at Bismarck Sea were operating under limited combat tour policies. Typically 50 missions or 6 months of combat duty, whichever came first, before rotating home to train the next generation of pilots. This system carefully preserved hard-won experience and disseminated tactical lessons throughout the entire force. Combat veterans became instructors back home, passing on their techniques to new pilots. Japanese pilots flew combat missions until they died in action. The expertise they gained at such terrible cost was lost forever when they were killed. By late 1943, most experienced Japanese pilots were dead, and their replacements were increasingly poorly trained novices being thrown into combat against American veterans with hundreds of hours of experience. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a convergence of multiple American technological advantages working together: industrial capacity to produce heavily modified aircraft in quantity, innovation culture that actively encouraged and rewarded field modifications, training resources for perfecting completely new tactics under realistic conditions, intelligence capability to locate enemy targets with precision, communication systems for coordinating highly complex attacks involving multiple unit types, supply chains capable of sustaining continuous operations indefinitely. No single advantage alone was decisive in isolation. Their combination working together proved completely overwhelming to the enemy. The Japanese faced not just superior numbers of equipment, but superior systems at every level: industrial systems, organizational systems, and technological systems that they simply couldn't match given their resource base. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea lasted only 3 days total, with the truly decisive action occurring in just 15 minutes on the morning of March 3, 1943. In those brief 15 minutes, the fundamental nature of warfare in the Pacific theater changed forever in ways that could never be reversed. Air power proved conclusively that it could control vital sea lanes without requiring naval vessels to do so. Industrial innovation demonstrated beyond doubt that it could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could possibly develop effective counters. American production capacity showed that sheer quantity, when intelligently applied, possessed a quality all its own that couldn't be matched by spirit alone. For the Japanese military, Bismarck Sea was far more than simply a tactical defeat to be absorbed and learned from. It represented proof that their entire philosophical approach to warfare had become completely obsolete in the face of modern industrial capabilities. Courage, fighting spirit, and centuries of martial tradition meant absolutely nothing when facing B-25s carrying 8 forward-firing machine guns and dropping skip bombs with scientific precision based on extensive testing. The best-trained warrior in the world was utterly helpless against an enemy who had successfully industrialized warfare itself down to a systematic process. The 2,890 Japanese military personnel who died in the waters of the Bismarck Sea were victims not merely of American bombs and bullets, but of a much larger technological and industrial revolution that had rendered their form of warfare as obsolete as the samurai sword itself. They had trained extensively for war fought by warriors against other warriors. Instead, they died in a war fought by machines and industrial systems that they had no capability to match or counter. For the American forces involved, Bismarck Sea comprehensively validated years of careful preparation and systematic innovation. Pappy guns field modifications, originally developed using salvaged parts and basic hand tools in primitive workshops, had proven more devastatingly effective in actual combat than any purpose-built weapon system. The successful marriage of American creative ingenuity with massive industrial production capacity had produced an entirely new form of warfare that Japan simply possessed no means to counter effectively. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the immediate Southwest Pacific theater. It demonstrated definitively that in modern industrialized warfare, production capacity fundamentally equals military capacity. The nation that could build the most equipment, train the most personnel, innovate the fastest, and adapt the quickest to changing conditions would ultimately prevail regardless of other factors. Traditional military virtues like courage, loyalty, and willingness for self-sacrifice remained important on an individual level, but they were no longer sufficient by themselves to determine victory. In 15 brief minutes over the Bismarck Sea, 8 modified bombers accomplished what the entire Imperial Japanese Navy with all its resources couldn't prevent from happening. They successfully cut Japan's vital supply lines and doomed its forces in New Guinea to eventual starvation and defeat. Those 15 minutes of concentrated destruction marked the precise moment when industrial warfare definitively and permanently replaced traditional military concepts throughout the Pacific theater. The Japanese soldiers and sailors who witnessed events they literally couldn't believe were happening had every right to be incredulous about what they were seeing. They were observing something that shouldn't have been remotely possible according to everything they knew and understood about naval warfare doctrine. But American industrial innovation had systematically made the theoretically impossible into routine procedure, transforming the previously unthinkable into standard operating doctrine. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as clear historical proof that in modern warfare conducted between industrial powers, the nation with superior factories will defeat the nation with superior warriors every single time. It was a brutal lesson written in flame and blood across the waters of Huon Gulf that sunny morning. A lesson that would fundamentally define the remainder of the Pacific War and shape how wars would be fought for generations to come. In the emerging age of fully industrial warfare, production capacity equals power, innovation capability equals strategy, and the humble assembly line proves ultimately mightier than the ancient sword. The Japanese officers aboard those destroyers simply could not accept or believe what was happening when modified B-25 strafers destroyed 8 massive transport ships in just 15 minutes of concentrated attack. By the time they finally accepted this new reality and understood its implications, events had already progressed far beyond the point where anything could be done. The war had effectively been lost not in those 15 minutes of violent destruction, but rather in the preceding years of methodical industrial preparation that made those 15 minutes of devastation operationally possible. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was simply the dramatic moment when that long-prepared victory became undeniably visible and obvious to all who witnessed the destruction unfolding before them.